Okay guys, so we've done some talking about the Cold War, so we're going to move into just some of the other areas that were impacted by the action, some of the hot spots. We've looked at Cuba and Korea. Some of that is covered in this presentation, but we're going to also look at some other areas, specifically in Latin America and in Asia. And we'll look at Indonesia or Vietnam later on in class that's kind of towards the end of the war, not towards the end, but at a later point in the war than where we're addressing now. So we'll go in depth with Vietnam when we get there. Okay, so Africa is the first area that we wanted to look at. So just like all the way throughout the Cold War, there are these conflicts between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the United States wants to keep the Soviet Union from backing any more of these countries where governments were being overthrown, which is what goes on in Africa. So the Soviet Union started to get involved with some new African nations, specifically Ghana and Guinea. So of course the United States, it starts to expand its aid in those countries, basically helping to give them more money, more resources, so that they have the ability to really take care of their people without depending on the Soviets. Also, another area of conflict was the Congo, and this is of course also between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the U.S. takes the side of one group that's in a civil war, and the Soviet Union takes the side of another group that was in the Civil War. So we actually, we see a hot spot there in the Congo as well. And when I say that they're taking sides, we didn't have troops on the ground, and the Soviet Union didn't have troops on the ground, but we were providing things like airplanes, trucks, technical advisors. So all of these things may have been well intended in supporting the people in the Congo, but overall just increased the violence and the number of deaths. So that's one of the key things to keep in mind about the Cold War, is that as we're providing these arms for people, we're putting weapons into the hands of people that we don't necessarily interact with. And we see that in the Middle East during this time a lot as well. So another area was the Philippines. So keep in mind that the United States had had some control of the Philippines during that imperialistic time that we talked about. So they were able to manage their own country for a while and have control of their own form of government. But during World War II, they experienced some, they were weakened by World War II essentially. So a lot of people saw this as an opportunity to overthrow a government that they did not like. So they were the first Asian country to win their independence. Unfortunately, with that independence came a lot of unrest. So a lot of Filipinos wanted reforms, specifically when it came to their land and what to do with their land. Some of the rebels that wanted these land reforms were communists, and by 1954 the government had defeated them. And it defeated them while telling them that they were going to make these land reforms. Of course, the United States did not back these communists. So we actually fought to make sure that these people did not take control of the Philippines. But these groups continued to have a really strong hold on the Filipino government, which once again makes the United States a little anxious, because you have people with strong communist leanings that have a very active role in how this government was being formed. Okay, Indochina, which is also Vietnam, had been under French control up until this point, also a result of that imperialism of World War I. So France struggled to maintain control after the damages of World War II. So keep in mind, we're still seeing the impacts of years and years and years of different people running these countries. And of course, France lost everything in World War II. So Ho Chi Minh led the fight for independence from France. He had communist support and was backed by the Soviet Union, which is how communism takes a grasp of Vietnam. The United States, of course, backs France in its attempts to keep Vietnam from becoming a communist country. The communists ended up winning, and they actually gained control of the northern part of Vietnam. The United States, of course, gets very heavily involved with this as a part of that Truman Doctrine, that doctrine of containment. So fighting in Vietnam lasted for almost 30 years. So we see the United States involvement becoming greater towards the end of this battle in Vietnam, which is when we're going to talk about it, since we're focusing on U.S. history. But it's important to understand that this is something that had been going on for 30 years. Latin America. So we see, of course, we've talked about Cuba and the issues going on in Cuba, and there are some similar things going on in other areas of Latin America. And it was all brought up by basically the poor conditions. And the poor conditions in these Latin American countries caused people to revolt, to want to be, have a larger part in the government. And a lot of these groups were anti-American. They didn't like American involvement in their economic decisions and other ways of life in their country. So the United States helped a lot of the military dictators. Those dictators had the ability to keep or gain power in several Latin American countries. This caused even further hostile feelings towards the United States. So this is how Fidel Castro comes to power in Cuba. He's a great example of this, and one that we can connect to because he's been an important part of history for a long time. So in January of '59, Fidel Castro led a successful revolt in Cuba. The Soviet Union promised to give him some of that aid that he needed. What I was talking about on the previous slide, some of the military support especially. Castro began to encourage other Latin American countries to revolt as well. And it's interesting, even though the people, for the most part, there was a large group of the people that supported Castro, there was a large group that also did not support him. And they actually ended up going into exile. And this is where you see a lot of Cuban immigrants coming into the United States. And we're going to talk about this some when we talk about the Cuban embargo, is that the number of Cuban Americans in Florida specifically really determines the outcome for the elections in Florida. And a lot of those people are coming from this big migration. So we've already talked about the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. You don't need to write this down. This is really just a review based on what we just talked to about with Fidel Castro. So in 1961, a group of Cuban exiles, secretly trained by the CIA, landed at the Bay of Pigs. That was in the southern coast of Cuba. This invasion failed. We know that it failed at this point. It was one of the things that John F. Kennedy was most embarrassed about. And it made Castro more popular. He has a victory against the United States, and the people saw that as a great thing. Which then, of course, leads into the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, we see photographs that the Soviets were building those warheads inside of Cuba, specifically on that northwest coast facing towards the United States. So we know that those bases were intended to intimidate the United States. Kennedy insisted that the Soviet Union remove those missiles, and he did that through imposing that naval blockade that we talked about. Remember, he calls it a quarantine because it was a more gentler term. He ordered the U.S. Navy to stop any Soviet ships from bringing missiles into Cuba. They were also stopped from bringing any other kind of support items as well. So this was a 13-day affair, and it was a big deal. It changed the way that people interacted with each other. We looked at the duck and cover drills that were having to be done in schools and the air raid sirens that were going off in the United States. And the concern was that these missiles were large enough that they could impact massive numbers of people. We read in one of the Kennedy memos that it could have been up to 80 million people that were impacted by these bombs. So the United States was exceptionally concerned about what was going on in Cuba. Finally, Russia pulls those missiles out of Cuba, and the crisis ends. But it definitely does not end. That does not mark the end of the problem with the Soviet Union. It just marks the end of the Soviet Union being involved in Cuba. So that covers most of the stuff that, most of the other areas of the world that were impacted by the Cold War. So keep that in mind as we're looking at the United States involvement. And please understand that the United States was actively involved in a lot of those different places, specifically in supplying a lot of weapons that are still impacting these countries today. See you guys tomorrow.